I usually just randomly hit record when we're not really paying attention, and then we go, "Oh no, it's already recording!" And by that time,
Yeah.
it's like
We've already
you can't
talked
even
about
tell.
really interesting things. Yeah.
Exactly, as is the case when we haven't talked in a long time.
Yeah.
Um, can I ask for an intro to you? And I obviously know your background from when we worked together, but I don't know what you've been up to properly lately. So
Yeah.
maybe from there are some strings that we can pull on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say a couple of words about what I've done previously, and then kind of draw out what I've been doing now. So I obviously, as you know, did my PhD on migration, worked at Nesta and looking at the creative industries and tech for a number of years. Founded and led the research team at Tech Nation, and really focused on kind of ecosystem building, thought leadership, and working with tech and non-tech partners to do that. Sometimes working with startups and scale-ups, but more often than not, we were thinking about kind of the other big corporates and organizations in the ecosystem and how they can turn the dial for startups. Then when Tech Nation lost its funding to Barclays, we wound the company down, sold it off to Founders Forum Group, and I did a few different things, and of course that's when we kind of met at that period of time, and I then ended up working for Notion Capital for 18 months, a Series A focused business software and SaaS venture capital investor based in London, but with a pan-European kind of outlook. Now have kind of pivoted their thesis a little bit more towards rematerialisation of tech, which I think is super interesting, and AI.
Mm.
So they've invested
Mm-hmm.
in companies like Cogna, super interesting company. Serial founder Ben, who was also the founder of Five, which was Five AI, sold to Bosch, based out of Cambridge years back. Cogna is doing some
Mm-hmm.
really interesting work, I guess, thinking about how to leverage AI for problem solving for large utilities companies and corporates. And then others like
Mm.
Isambard, who are effectively bringing high value, high kind of a high cost manufacturing into manufacturing hubs near cities and in cities, so that where
Mm.
the consumption of these kind of high spec parts is required, they're also being made there, which I think is super interesting. And the name Isambard obviously harks back to Britain's industrial
Mm.
past. So still have some connections with Notion Capital, and kind of follow avidly the work that they do, and then I've also been doing a variety of other things. So I've been working with organisations like the UK Tech Cluster Group and Sunderland Software City in the northeast of England, where we are building tech ecosystems both in the northeast of England and around kind of Newcastle, Sunderland, but also across various clusters in the UK through the Regional Tech Booster Programme, which is almost the latest iteration of government funding for tech ecosystem growth. So it's kind of come full circle. It went to Barclays, and now we've got it back
Yeah.
again. So that's exciting, and that project is kind of nearing an end. I've been doing an evaluation for that recently, working with
Yeah.
investors, so working VCs and private equity companies, working with some kind of universities, with angels, and helping those organizations understand where they should be kind of prioritizing their investments or focusing their investments, how they can do that in more effective ways. So sometimes it's about helping them measure and evaluate in more accurate and meaningful ways, and other times it's about pure play deal flow and helping them identify companies that they should invest in. So that's exciting. The other element to that, of course, is around kind of very early stage investors, as in the investors themselves are very embryonic, is helping them construct a
Yeah.
narrative that will help them land in the market in the most effective way, help them raise money, for example. So some really interesting work there. And then I've been doing quite a lot of work in East Africa with a company called Systemic Innovation, run by a great guy called Scott Walker. And we've been working on FCDO-funded projects through their RISER fund, Research Innovation Systems Africa fund, which has now also come to an end. But working in Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, to really look at high growth firms and scaling and how to kind of stimulate the innovation economies of those countries. The most recent piece within Ethiopia, where we've effectively written a startup and scale up strategy for the country to help them build upon a solid set of legislation, but legislation, like it's not an enabling infrastructure. It's really kind of a sort of a set of compliance-based and controlling infrastructure. So how they build upon that is important. And a few other things, I suppose, but I mean, not least working with organizations like Dealroom and others, data companies. Data is the backbone of all the work that I do as a researcher. So staying close to those companies and where they are innovating and helping them innovate is important. But I'll pause there because there's probably stuff that we can do.
There is so much to draw from here. And I realize that you just have an incredibly active mind, and there are so many opportunities that are coming your way. How do you decide what to work on these days? Because there are so many different ways that you can apply your clarity of thinking, and now we can build so many different things. Like, how do you make that decision about where to focus?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I often come back to. I don't think I always get it right, but I apply, I guess, a few different lenses, not particularly quantitative, but like how interesting I find the work, and more often than not, how interesting I find the work is aligned to whether I see an opportunity moving forward with either the ability to build on a piece of work or position what I could prospectively do going forward on the basis of that work. So, for example, there's a foundation in Europe that I'm doing some work with through Systemic Innovation at the moment. They are a large grant-giving foundation. They have over 1,500 funds. Many of those funds, they operate on the basis or they operate for other philanthropists. So someone, a high net worth individual, let's say, comes to them and says, I've got 10 million that I want to distribute to female entrepreneurs in West Africa over the next 5 years. Can you do that for me? And they will operate that fund for them and distribute it in a way that is most effective, that is compliant, that effectively takes the difficulty out of giving money out. And they do that for thousands, hundreds, thousands of different organizations, and they also do it on behalf of themselves. The interesting thing there is that they're doing all of this work and they're often measuring the outcome of their investments on a fund-by-fund basis. They're not really thinking about how the impact of one fund investing in something is impacting another fund investing in something else. And that could be a positive impact, of course. They could be quite synergistic. It could be that one fund is looking at female entrepreneurship in West Africa and another is looking at youth entrepreneurship and providing, I guess, foundational health care facilities to enable that kind of basic entrepreneurial ecosystem to thrive in the same set of countries, but they're not really thinking about how they work together or how they kind of build an ecosystem together or how they have kind of synergistic outcomes. So what we're hoping to do with that organization is to look at measurement, evaluation, and learning from a systemic perspective. How do we start to get at where there might be cannibalistic kind of outcomes as a result of funding similar things or different things, or where there might be synergistic outcomes? And that, for me, I guess, is one big market that is kind of untapped on a global basis. There are lots of people thinking about this stuff and lots of people who are talking about next generation measurement, evaluation, and learning, but there are very few people who are applying it in real world settings with big donors and funders and thinking very practically how we can then use that intelligence in order to drive better outcomes for the people that are receiving that funding, but also others in that ecosystem. So that for
Yeah.
me, I guess, is a good example of where interesting work becomes highly impactful work and ultimately becomes something that can scale up and then go a lot further. Of course, the slightly more mercenary kind of part of me says, well, yes, it's also about how I optimize for my own kind of personal return on investment. Where can I get the most money for the time that I'm putting into it? And of course, I balance that off against where I think that there's either good that I can do, or where there are interesting things that maybe aren't quite so well paid on the basis that there's not a market for it, or whatever it might be. So them working with, I don't know, larger corporates or private equity or other firms who perhaps are who see the time that I spend in working with them as more valuable than other people might do, then I'll kind of balance that off. So two things, I
Yeah.
guess, to really cut a long story short, it's where there's opportunity and interest and impact, and then where's the money ultimately, because of course I'm working in order to feel useful in the world and to do things that I find interesting, and ultimately to I hope do things that are going to make the world a better place overall. But that's not the only reason why I'm working.
Yeah. 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 That's really so I think about this a lot because I come back to the way that you structure your research thinking, and I was always struck by the way that you could take a problem and quite clearly say, hey, this is how I think we should approach it. I think this is important, this is important. Like, you cut through the noise very quickly. And I've been noticing in the work that I'm doing, it's like, it's very easy now to create code. It's very easy to create words on page, we'll call them. Whether or not they're useful is another thing. Like, that needs to be measured in itself. But I've been looking at different ways that you can pull public data sets and then intermesh them and do it kind of automatically in different ways. But now we have the ability to create all of this information. And the question is, how is it useful, or what is the best way to structure these things?
Yeah. I think that's right. And yeah, for me at least, I think that it's almost the middle component of much of the work that I'm doing is in the collection and then collation, and the analysis of data is becoming not easier, but it's becoming quicker in many ways. And I say it's not becoming easier because you still need to know what you're doing in order to get the best kind of outcomes from it, and to know how to bring things together in a meaningful way. What kind of analysis to apply to these things, and how to do it most effectively. But it can become easier if you set up the right systems, and you are able to do kind of work that feels somewhat repeatable, or at least you're applying the same or similar data, or bringing kind of other data in an additive way to answer different questions. That becomes something that does really lend itself to repetition and iteration, which is great. Where I think there's still huge value is in, yes, that ability to structure and to think through what those fundamental questions are, and really get to grips with the right questions required to tease out the answers that will ultimately help the client solve the challenge, or help us get a better understanding from both a strategic perspective, but also quite a practical perspective. What is the information we need to do something differently about this, rather than just to think differently about it, or to know something different about it. You need to do something, of course, because otherwise what you're doing is just a conceptual exercise. And then on the back end of it, of course, it's knowing how to use that information to do something different. And again, the two are different, of course. At the beginning, you can kind of make assumptions about what you might need, but at the end, it's really how you translate it into practical action. And I think, therefore, what I take from that is, yes, it's the thinkers at the start and it's the doers at the end. but the really valuable combination is in kind of real thoughtful operators. And to be a thoughtful operator in the age of AI looks like asking the right questions and being able to dive in and get your hands dirty at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a lot because there's so many people. I think I'm in a little bit of a bubble because a lot of the people that I talk to are using AI tools to create things, and people are getting very varied outcomes with the tools that they're using. Just to double click on this kind of asking thoughtful questions or collecting data in the right way. Has that changed at all for you? Like, how do you think about when you're, say, trying to evaluate an investment? Is it still the same methods of collecting the information, collecting the data about how that project might have gone, or has that also changed?
I think I've been doing a few projects recently around collecting, not even collecting data, but ultimately the objective is finding new ways to measure change or outcomes over a period of time in meaningful ways. And that necessitates collecting different data and data that perhaps has a different footprint to the data that we've collected before. I think organizations or companies, clients used to be a lot more comfortable with just having a snapshot of what has kind of happened, and having a series of snapshots enabled them to join the dots between the snapshots and say, well, if in 2023 we were doing X and in 2024 we were doing Y, then that's good or that's bad. But we need more nuance. And the work that I've been doing, for example, with a couple of universities who are collaborating via kind of government funding on growing the clusters in their respective geographies, they're really interested in knowing both what the outcomes of interventions that they're putting in place look like for the individual clusters, but also what flows between those two clusters and how that's changed. So whether it's about flows of capital, flows of knowledge, flows of people, all kinds of things, I guess. And that is quite a different set of questions, or at least it's quite a different premise than lots of work that we've previously had to do or been asked to do. I think that the process is somewhat similar, but the way that we think about the breadth and depth of data that we need to collect to answer the questions that are now being asked is quite different. And I think that there's an expectation that in order to have the gradation, the kind of the mosaic that we build up, really showing what we want to know at a fine-grained enough kind of resolution, we need to be collecting lots and lots of different data that we perhaps weren't collecting before, and we need to have a much more multifaceted approach to doing things. A good example of this is where I'm working with a Dutch data company, Dealroom, and Dealroom has built one of the world leading, if not the world leading, repository on startups and scale-ups. And it's not just a repository, it's a system of data collection and curation and dissemination. And it's used by thousands of investors the world over. It's used by lots of governments and other organizations to understand what's happening in their startup ecosystems. But fundamentally, it is company level data, and it's got lots of richness on people and these sort of things. So it has its limitations, of course. It doesn't look at some things, but it does really look at companies. Where I think things are changing a little bit for organizations like Dealroom is that they're increasingly being asked to think about where their data sits within a broader, I guess, environment of data. So how does it sit alongside labor market information? How does it sit alongside data around intellectual property? How does it sit alongside data on infrastructure or whatever it might be? And the answer is often it sits like this, but we don't do this thing. So how do we start to bring labor market information into that kind of firm level data ecosystem? Well, that's the kind of question that I'm hoping to answer and that we're working on actively at the moment with a few different clients. And I think it is fundamentally important to being able to really see things in the round and see them in a more systemic way. That's a driving force behind a lot of the work that I'm doing, is moving from ephemeral or programmatic or snapshot type views to a more longitudinal, coherent, systemic view of things.
I need to apologize. There's a little bit of rain fade. I can hear you. I just see you as pixels, and I assume that you see me as pixels too. But we do have a connection here, and it also records locally. Forgive the bluntness of this question, but it seems like we're getting better and better at doing the work of collecting data and making it rich and doing all of these things. Do you think, how do I phrase this? Is it having as big an impact as the extra effort, or are there diminishing returns on like collecting this really granular data? Like, are we collecting this data because we want to know, because now we can know? Or is it really that now the granularity that you can get is much, much better? Does that make sense?
It does. So I guess that the question is, we can collect a huge amount more now, but is it really having the kind of impact that we would hope it would have? And is it really transformative, or is it just kind of incrementally enabling us to get a little bit more understanding? I think my answer to that, and kind of almost and coming back to the original question as well, is I think there is a huge amount more that we can know about certain things than we have been able to know about them before. Let's take jobs as a good example. Most jobs now we are kind of accessing, or at least the open opportunities, vacancies, we're accessing online. So we are looking at job ads on LinkedIn or on Indeed or on various other places. And so inherently, that's publicly available data that can be used by a variety of different organizations. It can be collected, it can be kind of analyzed, and we can know a lot more about how jobs are being advertised, and obviously that allows us to infer a lot more about how the workforce is changing and all of these things than we perhaps have known before.
Yeah,
great. On the face of it, that's really helpful. But actually, when push comes to shove and we start to try and use that information, we encounter lots and lots of problems about the minutiae of how the data is actually kind of, what the data actually means. Because, of course, someone advertising a job online doesn't mean they fulfill it. It doesn't mean that that actually the person who they hire to do that job ends up being the right fit for that job. It doesn't mean that for example, they won't need to hire another one of those people in a few months' time, but then they maybe advertise it via a different source, or they use a headhunter instead, and so we don't see that kind of progression. So there are certain things like that are just, I guess, problematic elements of the data. But that's always been the case, whether the data has been harvested from publicly available sources or others. Where I think the real crunch point is in actually what we do with the information that we have. I think we know a lot more now than we ever have done, but we often end up with a kind of an information overload that leads to a sense of inertia. It's a kind of, whatever people call it, analysis paralysis or whatever. You end up with too much material and you get bogged down in doing the analysis rather than actually making a decision. And where I think we can usefully get to, where I'm trying to push both clients that I'm working with directly and other kind of organizations that specialize in data curation and use, is to be quite practical and to take the middle ground in terms of that analysis. Yes, we should certainly be using data to drive better decision making. We need evidence. We shouldn't be making pure gut feel decisions. At the same time, though, we shouldn't be letting this prevent us from making timely decisions. And we should also be experimenting with our decision making. We can collect all the data that we can possibly collect on a thing, but it won't necessarily tell us whether it's going to whether the decision we make is going to be the right one or not. So then it's about mitigation of risk around the decision that you're making, and it's about experimentation and iteration in terms of how those decisions kind of play out. Doing so in an informed way, making decisions where the risk is mitigated, and then iterating if that decision is not quite the right one, is I think the way that we need to start seeing things. What I worry is that we're seeing a bit of a polarization outside of that. We're seeing either decisions made with very little evidence on the basis that we must make a decision. That's always been the case, and something that we've seen over hundreds, if not thousands of years, because often the data hasn't been there, and so people have just used their kind of gut feel, and either they've been lucky and made the right decision, or they've not, and it's been catastrophic. Or we see that kind of there's a lot of churning of kind of information around, but very little done with it, and neither of those things are helpful, in my opinion. What we really need is that kind of blended approach that means that we're not waiting, but equally we're not betting.
It's a very measured answer, and I appreciate it, especially because you're so thoughtful. I think a lot of people fall into this bucket of sounding smart and doing all the analysis in the world, and then not actually being very hands-on, not really being willing to put their I don't know, reputation behind something, which like you've referred to a few times, like the goal of all of these things is to take action, to change behavior, to change something that's real in the world. I sometimes think of it as that if your job is always to think about thinking, then you will just be you'll be habitually thinking. Whereas if you can find ways to, how do you have practices for how to make things practical, how to in your own work get things like, I have a couple, the 80% rule, like I'll get something to 80% done and then go, cool, that's enough. Do you have things like that? What helps you?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I guess some of them are very much about operating in a community of practice and working with people, and others are more kind of, slightly more sort of conceptual, I suppose. So first, I guess I would get it to kind of, even less than 80%. I would say get it to the point at which you feel like you've done more than you haven't. So you're over 50% of it being good, and then share it with people. And that of course means that you have to have people that you believe can provide you with helpful feedback at that stage of whatever it is that you've done, progress. It might be an application, it might be a piece of writing, it might be a thought or an idea, for example, that you can communicate verbally. But whatever it is, I think it needs to be kind of over 50% good or over 50% done, so that you can then start to iterate on it. But my feeling is, don't wait until 80%. 80% is probably good enough for it to be kind of released into the world. But let's go even further back and release it to a group of critical friends who can then provide you with feedback even sooner. Because I think in an age where we are so used to seeing such unfiltered and often quite uncritical stuff, whether it's writing again or videos or opinions. The most valuable thing you can do is have a filter of real people who are operating at a good, high level, at least whatever that means for the work that you do, and who can give you a variety of different opinions. So that, I think, is something that I've been happily able to foster on the basis of working with a variety of different people in different organizations, and having kind of spent a bit of time in the space that I'm in, kind of ecosystem building, data research, high growth companies, creative industries. There are a few different people who I know I can say, hey, what do you think of this? The other thing, I guess, is just the way that I approach doing things, and this is the more conceptual part, and it's
Mm.
it's a kind of a rapid build process whereby more often than not, of course, I'm working with clients where I have to provide I talk with them. They know they've got a thing that they want to do, maybe, or maybe they don't, but we have a conversation and they say,
Mhm.
yeah, I want to do something and this thing might look like this. And I say, well, it could look like this. And shall I put a proposal together, give them a proposal? So that's almost the framework of the thinking. It's the commercial proposition. It's how we might do work together and what the exchange of value looks like.
Mm.
Then, of course, if they say yes, it's about then building the right frameworks, firstly, to enable effective communication with that client, but also to enable me to structure my work and my practice in the right way. And I think not rushing headlong into doing things too quickly, but spending the time building the right scaffolding around projects that I conduct, again, helps me with both efficiency, but also helps me think about how I can be most valuable to the people that I'm working with, but also to myself, I suppose, and be most efficient with my time and enable me to spend time with other problems and other clients and with my family and all of these things that are of course important. And again, sometimes I think it can seem a bit strange talking about spending time doing other things or with family in the context of a professional conversation, but actually it harks back to that point that I kind of mentioned around thinking systemically. I'm not a kind of a program. I don't just run for the purpose of doing work. I work in a system, and I work in a system that is comprised of all of these different things. And so I must, as someone who is trying to be most efficient with the way that I allocate resources, think about all of the ways in which I'm doing that. And and again, I wouldn't want to suggest that I spend kind of hours a day thinking about this stuff. I don't. But when I am asked to reflect on it, ultimately that's where I kind of end up, is that I do try to think quite um, holistically about how I allocate resources and how I spend time doing things. Because ultimately, if I'm not, then I'm missing a big part of the puzzle.
Mm. Yeah. To me, it's the energy that you
Mm.
have, and there are different forms of energy. There's like, did you get enough sleep?
Mm.
Did you eat well enough? But also, like, are you doing things that you talked about? You work on projects that excite you. That's one of the ways that you make decisions. Um, I have noticed this in my own life that sometimes I will feel burnt out by something, and it's not because I'm working too much on projects generally. It's because I'm putting too much effort or attention into a project that actually I'm not very excited about, and it's just something that either has the scope has been blown out, or there's some kind of way that um, yeah, so I like to think about the energy that the things that you do that create energy,
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than just the yeah. Um, Thinking about your going back to data for a second,
Mm.
is there any data, any information, anything? I won't limit it to just like individual pieces of data, but is there anything that you really wish there was easy access to?
Mm. I think it's a good question because, of course, it's there are certain, I mean, and I could go kind of to the nth degree and say it would be great to know about all of these things that we could never possibly know about. But in my
Yeah.
work, and I guess with some of the questions that I'm trying to tackle at the moment, and the things that I wish that I had that I don't have, it would be things like information around informal entrepreneurial activity in developing countries. So in some of the countries that I've been working in East Africa over the last few years, and in fact in some other places in the world as well, we know that there are kind of thriving entrepreneurial ecosystems. Often it's necessity entrepreneurship, but that
Mm.
doesn't mean that it's not incredibly exciting and interesting and vibrant. And of course, precarious and sometimes dangerous, physically dangerous, and sometimes I guess it is work that people are doing that that perhaps we don't think of as work in the West, or that we think about slightly differently. But that kind of activity is very rarely captured in publicly available data, or even on web-based data and that kind of thing. So that's one area I'd love to know more about. And at the moment, often what we will do is conduct surveys or interviews or key informant interviews and these kinds of things that are a lot more qualitative in their nature. Surveys, obviously, the extent to which your sample is representative of the population is always a little bit dubious when you don't really know what the population looks like, and that can be tricky, right? How do we know if we've captured a good sample based on the fact that we don't really know all the people or things or companies or whatever that are out there?
Yeah.
And the answer, of course, is we can't know. And so we have to just kind of have the best informed sense of what we can, or use proxy data to help us try and understand what a population might look like based on other places where data is being collected in a more thorough way. Of course, in the likes of the UK and the Netherlands, for example, or Germany for that matter, where I've conducted surveys recently, we have official statistics. We have official data where it's a census, or where we have a clear sense of what the total population looks like, and then we can be very sure that the work that we've done, or that the sample that we've collected is accurate and representative of that broader population. And in Germany, for example, I did some work recently I say recently, about a year ago now, but it was with Google for Startups, helping them understand how companies in Germany, particularly how startups in Germany, were adopting, adapting, or generating artificial intelligence. And that was super interesting on the basis that it was being used to have really meaningful conversations around policy and around regulation. So the AI Act in Europe, what does it ultimately mean for startups, and how are startups engaging with AI at the moment, and nesting the conversation in that kind of nuanced understanding of how companies are adopting and adapting and creating. But of course, we can't do that in Ethiopia necessarily. But we'd love to, because of course, Ethiopia has a population that is significantly larger than Germany, about 125 to 135 million people in Ethiopia. So yeah,
And
when we
Germany's
look
what, 70 million, something like that?
I think
70,
so,
80?
yeah, 80, I think, more or less. But what we see, I guess, is and the reason why it matters and why I mention it is because we see a bit of a mismatch between where ultimately, perhaps, well, and this is an opinion, we see a mismatch in where we need information versus where we have information, and where we need data and we want data to understand, I guess, trends, for example, where we see huge populations in certain places, and we know that it's likely those populations continue to grow, and we know that it's likely that those places, for example, Ethiopia, Nigeria, they're likely to be far more important in terms of people power and workforce, and on a global basis, there are going to be more Ethiopians in the world than there will have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and there are going to be fewer Japanese and Chinese people, for example, in the world than there were 20, 50 years ago. So ultimately that global dynamic is going to change, but we don't have particularly good data on what those people in Ethiopia are doing, what the economy looks like, and really building it up from the ground up. That's, I guess, some of the work that I've been doing with various partners and collaborators and friends, is to try to turn the light on in different places from a data perspective. And I say turn the light on because loads of stuff is going on already, and lots of the people operating in those ecosystems simply are able to see in the dark, but we're not. So, we have to turn the light on, and we have to think about this in the context of other data that enables us kind of comparison. So, yeah, that's a big one for me, I guess, to kind of summarize. It's being able to understand often quite informal activity that's happening in places where we just don't have the right data infrastructure or the right systems, or where there's just a difference in the way that people think about certain fundamental concepts in our kind of day-to-day lived experience, like work or leisure or family, like that. It's just different, and so we need to find different ways to capture this kind of information.
Yeah. Please call me out if you think that this is not, or if any of the things that I say are not logical or don't make sense to you. But I studied economics, and I loved economics. It was fun and interesting, and a really interesting way to see the world. But one of the things that I realized is that we're trying to model a world, and bear in mind, this is undergraduate economics. But like when you're looking at macroeconomics, for example, you're trying to model a world, and you're trying to model growth rates, and you're trying to do all of these things with really, really, with data either that is super sparse, or just that you're guessing at numbers like the growth rate of an economy over 10 years. And if you don't have those inputs correct, sorry, what I mean is if the inputs are at all off, then your outputs will just be completely off. And I think that what I'm hearing here is that like we're slowly getting better at collecting this data, and it's getting more granular, but we're still fundamentally doing the same thing. We're still trying to understand a world and make comparisons in a place where there is missing data, where there's places where we have to guess at things, or where we just not necessarily understanding all of the dynamics between the pieces of data. So
I think there are three things that I would kind of respond to that with. I think broadly speaking, you're right, and there are three reasons. The first is that we are, of course, always trying to measure change, and change is constantly happening, and new things are happening, and we're having to find new ways to measure these new things because they don't look like the things that we were trying to measure before, and therefore we have to innovate. So when, for example, we saw a fundamental shift to companies principally operating through websites as their kind of public face, if you like, or where we saw e-commerce being a principal kind of mode by which people bought consumer goods and these sorts of things in certain places and in certain areas of kind of the economy or certain types of consumer goods. It necessitated looking differently at or looking at different data to understand it. The second thing I think is that we've gotten better at some data collection activities, and I say this kind of with a slightly Western-centric kind of lens, or through a Western-centric lens, but we've gotten better at measuring certain things to do with our economy on the basis of different data being available that allows us to fine-tune some of these bigger, more fundamental econometric models. And I'm thinking particularly about things like, I don't know, monetary policy and things like that. I fundamentally relied on very similar data to what we've always used, but actually some new data has enabled us to kind of hone it and tweak it and get slightly more accurate, or just be slightly more responsive. And I think yes, there are certain things that we're always going to be slightly off with, but we can start to get incrementally better at them because new data is available. So that's almost the opposite to the first argument I made, is like new things demand new data, but actually new data can allow us to do new things, and that can kind of be a useful kind of additive part. But then I guess the third element of this is really where we are seeing, I would argue, kind of false positives in the data that can sometimes throw a lot of these things off. And false positive, false negative is actually just kind of falsity and noise within the data, because with more and more data, more and more information, actually, you might think, well, yes, that will allow us to hone these fundamental models. It will allow us to be clearer, but understanding what is noise and what is signal can often become quite obscure in a world that is kind of being driven by everyone suggesting they are the signal and not the noise. And so, yeah, I would say the third element is really like knowing what to trust and not to trust, and knowing what kind of data is helpful and not helpful. Um, and that's why things tend to change quite slowly, at least in the way that we do measure some core part or core things to do with our nation states on a global basis, or to do with our economies. We tend to use quite traditional methods that sometimes do get things wrong when you look at them longitudinally, and but actually they're less subject to kind of wild swings because they use data that is slightly more ironclad. So, yeah, I think you're right. And ultimately, I think what we're seeing is, of course, in many of the things that we measure, we're seeing an infiltration of economics by data science and by artificial intelligence and by lots of other kind of interesting and emergent forces that will strengthen, but they will strengthen on the basis of critical reflexivity and with a lot of checks and balances to ensure that we aren't starting to measure the wrong thing or see kind of erroneous noise creep into the way that we're measuring. I think for me the conversation that we've had around how we can start to capture informal activity, conversations around how we can start to capture things that we're really not capturing at all at the moment, other than perhaps through surveys or interviews, is a fundamentally different conversation to ones around how we hone some of these core economic precepts of our kind of our world. And it's really how much error are we willing to tolerate? Because, of course, going from kind of very little understanding of informal work in Ethiopia, let's say, to a highly erroneous but somewhat accurate sense of what informal work looks like is probably tolerable. Going from a kind of a pretty broad brush and maybe not a particularly timely understanding of economic growth to a very timely but kind of wildly inaccurate understanding of economic growth, or even accurate, because of course to see something go like that can be very accurate, but actually what does it actually mean over time is and sometimes we need that broad brush in order to see the kind of the prevailing trends, rather than seeing all the noise, because we as humans are not particularly good at pattern recognition. We're not good at the kind of being bombarded by a million things at once and seeing where the kind of the clarity is, at least not on the basis of vast quantities of quantitative data.
Yeah, we see two or three things happen.
Yeah.
We see ups and downs, and we go, "Oh, that's a pattern," and then you zoom out, and it's like, "Oh no, that was a blip." Like some of these things that we think are patterns are really just nothing. They're noise. They're outliers. Looking at, I'm really curious to get your view on AI, because I'm sure it permeates a lot of the work that you do, or maybe not. I don't know. I find that there are some issues with it, some reliability issues, some kind of, especially when you are seeking truth, when you're seeking signal, there's kind of an erosion of truth and an erosion of trust sometimes when we're working with these tools. And not to taint this question at all, but like, are you finding that these tools are useful? Like, are you using them in the work that you're doing, or are you finding that they're still too unreliable to be able to use?
Yeah, to answer it in a very short way, I guess, yes, I'm using lots of different tools, but very much acting as the human in the loop and using other people to kind of go back to that point around how I kind of structure my work and structure
Mm,
my thinking, using lots of other people to also reflect on some of the things that we're kind of producing together, or that I've produced, in part with artificial intelligence and in part with more traditional non AI based methods. So I will,
sure.
and to go a bit deeper into that, I will often use tools like Claude and Chat GPT and Perplexity, and I will use them for doing things like writing, helping me write up somewhat unstructured thoughts, helping me do more kind of practical operational things. Of course, in
Right.
terms of the outputs that I produce, they are reports often, or they're dashboards, or they're presentations, or their positioning papers, or strategy documents that I deliver to um, a client, or they might be even decisions that I suggest that a client should make, or that I make on behalf of a client. And more
Mm,
often than not, they are not that I can sometimes, of course, use tools to help me draft these things up in a speedy way, and then go through and kind of edit myself, like I might do the work of a colleague. But I will more often than not produce the bulk of those outputs myself. I think it's the more foundational, operational bits of my work, like um, not having to make notes in a meeting anymore, and having the transcript available immediately, and then being able to stick that transcript in a variety of different tools to tell me what the most important bits of it were, or to pull out
yeah.
information that I might not remember, or like just really basic things that just make it so much easier to operate, and without all of the transaction costs of going back to a client and saying, "I know you said that you were interested in doing this, but I can't quite remember what it was. How much did you say it was going to, or when did you say you wanted it, or whatever it might be." So these things
Yeah.
that actually, when you ladder them up, end up converting into hours and days and weeks of work over the course of a year. Um, if not more, to be honest. I think like the productivity enhancement in using some of these tools is really so fundamental that it could be months of the year that I'm saving, and so and it is. I'm almost certain of it. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
that tends to be how I use AI, is kind of with in a measured way, and almost to help me overcome a kind of writer's block or a creative block when I'm drafting something. I'll do most of the analysis from a quant perspective, in of course using tools that in their own ways are programmatic. So you often using I guess more kind of computational analysis, rather than doing sort of super manual analytical work, but then maybe feeding some of that data to ask what one tool thinks the trend could potentially be caused by, and asking my friend who I'm on a call with what they might think, who is a person, not an AI tool. I've not got to that stage of considering AI tools as my friend yet.
Yeah.
And then I might, for example, have a think about, and almost try and think a little bit sort of left field myself, by looking at, I don't know, um, the extremes of thinking around of what these kind of trends might be caused by. I'll read, and almost in a pretty academic way, I'll read what a sort of a thinker on one pole thinks about this, and what a thinker on another pole thinks about this, and then almost use that as collateral to think about what it might actually mean. Um,
Mm,
and that, I guess, is in an example of where it's not, but there's a lot of room for maneuver in terms of what things might actually mean. Because I think the reason why I major on this is that the data analysis, and the ability to write stuff around it, is becoming less and less differentiating as a process. The interpretation of that information, and how you and then how you make decisions on the basis of that interpretation,
mm.
is the differentiating element.
Yeah, and like your point at the start, how how usable this is, how much it changes, how much it creates action, how much it creates
Yeah.
some kind of output. I also think about this as like you produce often reports or decisions, or like your outputs are a certain thing right now. I wonder if in the not too distant future, some of your outputs might be an API that links to a data set with a bunch of structured data or decisions based on specific questions, or even like a RAG
Hmm.
system where somebody could. I'd love to build a George Windsor um, Claude RAG data
Hmm.
set that you chat to and it learns from you and then updates the database as you chat
Yeah.
with it.
I
I
think, I
think
mean,
that'd be
I
really
think
fun.
I think you're right. I would almost argue that the value of something like that would be sat in a stack with lots of other things that either wrap around it or complement it. And increasingly, I think where we're seeing the value of SaaS being amplified, or data as a service, software as a service being amplified, having um, is in having the more traditional service layer sat around it or on top of it, that effectively sort of amplifies the way that data becomes useful for a client, or in some cases kind of disguises the fact that it is ultimately a SaaS product, but that little bit of service on top, to make sure that it kind of reaches the mouth of the client, so to speak. If you're if you're thinking about a kind of feeding analogy, I've got a young son, so I am, and so you need to make sure that it's not just a plate of food sat in front of them, that actually it's something that they are consuming and that they are getting the nutrients from. So, yeah, a
Mm,
little bit of service goes a long way, and sitting that alongside a few different kind of SaaS products and maybe some more service looking components of a stack is kind of where I think the future takes us in this area. Um, but as I say, I think a lot of this is really down to the ability of consultants to help clients interpret and use this information in meaningful ways, and they're not going to get that through they're not necessarily going to get that through a dashboard or through an API. It demands a more sophisticated
mm,
use.
mm. And maybe even some more creativity about how we. I mean, the real value of service, or the real value of me working directly with you, is that you have this real time. You have uh, however many years of human experience dealing with humans and understanding that you can adapt the output that you need to give to whatever it is that I'm experiencing. If I'm breaking down in tears and you're trying to tell me about the startup ecosystem in Ethiopia, that's something a robot might do, and instead you can very, very easily context switch, right?
Indeed.
Um,
Indeed.
and that's like quite an extreme example, but I think that that ability to adapt is
Yeah.
something that will take a long, long time, especially when we're doing human to human commerce. Um, I do see a world in which we have quite a lot of AI to AI commerce, which like the packages and the deliverables and all of these things will be vastly different.
Yeah.
But when the buyer is a human or a government or an organization that moves very slowly,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I see it to be like that. Is there anyone right now that you're sorry, I can
No, no,
I
no,
might be
please. No,
interrupting.
I was kind of agreeing with you. I think, yeah, that's absolutely right. No, you go for it. Far away.
Is there anyone that you're interested in meeting right now, working with? Like what kinds of things are you when you go to bed at night
Mm.
thinking, "Oh, I hope this person comes into my life."
Yeah. For me, the kind of people that I'm interested in meeting or working with are people who are who are doing a couple of different things. They are probably making something. They're probably making something that has a physical artifact of some variety. I think that's quite interesting. it is quite different to what I do. I kind of am seeking that out, not least because I think, of course, we all operate in both corporeal and cognitive worlds, and so yes, we can. Yes, it's good to have things that are not physical artifacts, but they are things that enable us to think in different ways. But it's also good to have physical things that enable us to engage it with and kind of in the world in different ways. And I think also it probably ties back into the type of world that we're living in at the moment. There are lots of things happening in the world that mean that physicality is becoming a kind of an important mode through which we engage with one another as humans. And I think that you can look at that in lots of different ways, but I'm really thinking about it as in the sense that violence and war and geopolitical unrest is leading to conflict, and conflict, of course, is often borne out through a variety of different technologies, but ultimately it's conflict between human beings that is kind of causing and ultimately kind of being the ultimate endpoint of much of this activity. And so I think that's a kind of an interesting is not the right word. It's a meaningful way to think about this. There are other,
What
of
kind
course.
of
Sorry, go.
Sorry to interrupt. What kind of physical things are you thinking? Like, I'm imagining sculptures, products, things like that. Like,
Yeah.
what
So
comes to your mind?
I'm thinking about a few things. So I'm thinking from a professional, or at least from a kind of a work and sort of where I can provide things that might be useful in terms of growing areas of the economy or growing companies. I think there are a few kind of interesting things. So having seen with both some of the things that some of the investors that I'm invested in, or with some of the companies that I'm working with, having seen a real shift towards rematerialisation, I think that's that kind of enchants me in a way. I mentioned the company Isambard. Notion Capital are invested in Isambard, and I'm invested in the fund that invested in Isambard. So I have a kind of a vested interest in Isambard. But they're a really interesting example of kind of high value manufacturing through a different model. Other companies are operating in kind of defense and other areas that I'm not necessarily invested in, I think are also interesting. And I went to, during London Tech Week last year, I went to an event that was about defense tech and about dual purpose technologies. And it was one of the first that I've been to, and I've been to a couple since, or at least inadvertently. So it's not something I've kind of made a beeline for, but I think that's really interesting that has become kind of a part of our mainstream conversation around what the tech ecosystem looks like. And it's become a core facet of how we invest in tech, is to invest in companies that are building the next generation of technologies to enable either conflict resolution or more effective. Well, ultimately, it is all about conflict resolution, right? Whether you kind of inflict massive damage or not. So, but it's a weird conversation for us to have, I think, or at least it felt weird to me, still does. Because it's not it's not the SaaS-based, fairly kind of banal, albeit somewhat still problematic tech ecosystem that we've been kind of brought up on. It's a site kind of turned towards science fiction and perhaps towards more explicit, problematic encroachment of advanced and emerging technology into areas that we find taboo still, as particularly in the West. So I think that's interesting. But then from a personal perspective, yes, I think commodities, certain commodities, I think are really interesting, and I've been kind of looking at for a number of years now, kind of precious metals and other commodities, and like how they almost fit within an investment portfolio, where some parts of that portfolio are extremely high risk and extremely kind of volatile, and others are not. But also where, for example, we have seen such volatility in what have traditionally been incredibly slow moving and stable commodities like silver and gold,
Mm-hmm.
and of course recently in oil. That makes a lot of sense, of course. So I think, yeah, looking at these things too, but also valuing them valuing them in two ways, I guess. Valuing them as constituent components in lots of kind of electronics and batteries and physical things that we are building that we need more of, that we're not very good still at kind of recycling often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then secondly, that their kind of intrinsic value. We like shiny, pretty things as human beings, and we've valued gold not least because of its because of some of its physical qualities, but principally because of its aesthetic qualities, and the same with silver and such as well. So, yeah, I think
Yeah.
thinking about it from a cultural perspective as well as a purely kind of economic perspective, I think is fascinating, and finding people who know really what they're talking about in these spaces, but also who work perhaps in adjacent industries, working in petrochemicals, working in other areas. I think um, it's interesting to, for me at least, as someone whose career has been about thinking differently and using information in order to enable different thinking or decision making, or better thinking or decision making, versus someone perhaps whose career has been about extracting material from the ground in the most efficient way is kind of is super interesting.
True.
Other people who I kind of am really interested in meeting or like thinking about at the moment are I guess people working in increasingly hybrid um, spaces from kind of a sectoral or methodological perspective. So I'm doing a fair amount of work in areas like createch at the moment, that kind of look at, and so to kind of say what createch is, or the way that we've
Yeah,
defined it. I
please.
did some work with um, DCMS and the Royal Anniversary Trust, and a colleague, Eliza, and a couple of other colleagues, Tom and Alan, last year, mapping createch in the UK. And createch is where we see the use of emerging technologies in the creative industries. Um, and it could be that at the very core, we see it about the creation of new technology in the creative industries. It might be about developing a new way of, I don't know, a new robotic technology, or a new um, form of technology, either driven by or fundamentally kind of creating a new kind of artificial intelligence in the creative industries. Or it might be about a company adopting AI or adopting robotics to help them, for example, build new widgets, whatever it might be. So, and that
Yeah.
I think is fascinating, the hybridity, and increasingly looking not for containerization and for how we can put things in buckets, but looking for how we can bridge across these areas that perhaps people have traditionally, or kind of even in recent years, started to try to put things into, and really thinking about how we break that down, but without losing that sense of rigor and structure and precision with how we think about these things. Because, of course, it is really useful to have set ways of thinking about things for consistency and for replicability and scalability. But how do we then start to blend them together in equally robust ways, but also kind of meaningful ways? So those people doing stuff like that, I think, super interesting.
Yeah, it reminds me of that. The man's name is escaping me. He's a PhD and wrote a book called The Medici Effect. I
Mm,
think we might have spoken about this.
yeah.
Um, and this idea that if you have everybody in the same industry talking about something, then your progress is quite linear.
Mm,
And if you have people from different industries all coming together, and you think about ideas as atoms, then the way that ideas from different industries hit each other and they explode, you get this. He argues that that's what the Renaissance came out of, the
mm,
Medici family bringing all of these artists from different disciplines into the same place, and them having discussions about different fields, different arts, different mediums.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
this
I
is
think I think that with the way that kind of on a global basis, and obviously making kind of quite a good deal of simplification in this argument, but as things evolve, we often try to find ways to better categorize and to classify things. And I think almost
yeah,
going back to first principles and saying we can actually start to think differently about things by bringing people who think differently about things together is a really interesting concept, and one that we have kind of lost in a way through some of the ways that we work as individuals now. We work in often quite isolated ways. We don't necessarily work in silos, but we can be physically isolated from other people that we might just serendipitously kind of bump into otherwise, or whatever. And again, I've heard a lot of kind of almost our own kind of contemporary renaissance in talking about how we can collaborate and how we can create opportunities for serendipity in more meaningful ways. And often that does boil down to being in the same geographical or physical proximity to other people. And
yeah.
ultimately it comes back to arguments for clustering and that are fundamentally predicated on why our kind of landscape has formed in the way that it has from an economic perspective, but also a kind of a geographical perspective. We get a huge amount as human beings from being close to other people and sharing things both deliberately and inadvertently.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Um, I wonder what your opinion is on this. I'm always building little tools because I have lots of ideas and I like to bring them into the world. Um, I have put together a website based on this idea that there are lots of people now that have the ability to build things, and I would like people like me to be building the right things. And maybe there's something already like this in the world, but basically, I called it problem space.
Hmm.
And the idea is that either we host a little webinar where somebody brings a problem and a bunch of people brainstorm about different ways to solve that. Or we also have a product hunt style leaderboard for types of problems that people have. Say corporates would say, hey, we've got this really specific problem. And then people can come and attach their solutions or come and contact the problem haver, the person who's bringing the problem forward. Are there things like this that you're aware of, or are there, like I'm trying to flip the sales script
Hmm.
so that anybody who's building a solution can try to solve problems that are already out there instead of having this thing where you
Yeah.
make all of this junk and then try and find someone to give it to, you know?
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of the approaches that have been taken to this, but more from the perspective of a kind of well, slightly more analog rather than a product-based approach to doing it, maybe a service-based approach to thinking about these things. So challenge prizes being one way of doing this. And when I worked at Nesta, that would be a really important kind of approach to bringing the right people who can help solve a challenge to the challenge. And a really good example is with the Longitude Prize that was run by Nesta with the Observer. I think it was a number of years back. Actually, I'm sure that there's still something similar going. Longitude Prize has its roots in being able to calculate longitude, and there was a prize that was given. I think it was by the government in the UK to calculate longitude. And ultimately, it led to the ability to calculate longitude as well as calculate latitude so that ships could understand where exactly they were in the world rather than just having a one-dimensional sense of where they were in the world, of course, which was terribly problematic and caused lots and lots of ships to get lost at sea and that kind of thing. So this was a challenge prize, fundamentally. It was
Yeah.
help us calculate longitude and we'll give you £500, which is the equivalent to like £10 million in today's money or something like that.
Yeah.
And it led to that challenge being solved. And the Longitude Prize, as I kind of knew it, hosted by the Challenge Prize team at Nesta when they were still within the Nesta structure, was a similar concept, but to solve some big problems around things like aviation, around health, around other kind of social or environmental kind of challenges that we're experiencing in the world. And that, I think, is a really effective way to bring great thinkers to the table, as long as you structure it in the right way. And I think it's like anything. If you you need to make sure that the prize is big enough, which is a
Yeah.
kind of a basic but often overlooked thing. We often think that people are going to do this out of the kindness of their hearts or because they are just super interested in this stuff. But no, you do need to incentivize people in the right way. Um, and organizations like the Behavioral Insights team will tell you to what extent you do need to incentivize people to do things based upon who they are or what their kind of characteristics are and that kind of thing. And I think, and the best ways to incentivize people, because of course, yes, it's often about money. I think that can be a really important lever, and we shouldn't be too kind of sniffy about it, but sometimes it's other things as well. And it's also about having, I guess, the right systems to enable communication, to enable the fact that the prize exists, to be communicated with the broadest audience it possibly can, so that you are really trying to kind of bring people in from the biggest pool that you possibly can. It's about having the right judging process and the right kind of systems to enable decision making around who should win the prize and what a good solution looks like. It's about having the right information articulated about what you're hoping to achieve and all of these things that yes, you do see it through many digital tools or applications, but actually I think for me at least, some of the most exciting ways in which I've seen this done before are where, yeah, you're able to do it through a big event, bring people together, bring everyone to bring the crowd together, and then harness that intelligence in a very human way, but actually that has repercussions that go way beyond that room.
Mm. How do you feel about prediction markets?
Prediction markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm. It's something that I'm probably less. I'm probably less informed to talk about this stuff than I should be or could be. But I think it's super interesting, and I know I've seen, of course, a variety of different companies, and some obviously much more kind of prevalent in terms of their brand and other things than others. But I think it's something that we've seen for a long time now, of course, and we've seen some really interesting examples of how these kind of whether they were known as prediction markets or not in the past, how these things were effectively used to create value, or actually to see the kind of the transfer of value between one person and another. Effectively, to me, I mean, for me at least, prediction markets are simply an extension of our proclivity to bet and gamble as a species. I think it's just
Yeah, basically.
it's an extension of our kind of our addiction to the idea that we can have a good guess at what might happen, but we can't know it. So yeah, and of course, plenty of people, plenty of companies have made fortunes out of predictions. But
The
the
margin.
kind of the inverse of predictions, of course, is um, being able to structure the way that other people predict or put kind of an interest in what might happen in the future in a meaningful way. I think about gambling companies. I think about gamblers who have made a lot of money by being very data driven in the way that they've gambled, and doing so in a very structured way that doesn't look like gambling, that looks like financial services or looks like something else. And so, yeah, I think it's a bit of an extension of that. But I think for me at least, the interesting thing about these prediction markets is the way that they are using data in kind of new and innovative ways, and capitalizing on this kind of capitalizing on the kind of the increase in data that's available and different types of data. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, but again, something I've kind of not dived into too much. And I guess for a few different reasons, probably. I think not least because I suspect it's not something that I would ever have the either a particular interest in being involved in. I can very easily get very into lots of things to the extent that I think I have quite an addictive personality, but gambling is not one of them, fortunately, and so I feel very
Yeah.
lucky for that, because I think a lot of this is kind of can be somewhat inherent to an individual as to whether they find that exciting or interesting or whatever it might be. And then the other side of it is a far more practical thing, which is to be able to have that lens on the world that means that you have more data, but you also have the ability to use that data better than anyone else to understand what is likely to happen better than anyone else, given the set of
Mm.
conditions that we're in and the characteristics of whatever it is that you're trying to predict. I think it's something that takes a huge investment and something that would ultimately require a much more kind of organizational and prospectively kind of institutional build around some of the things that I do. A lot of what I try and do is far less about prediction and far more um, about measurement and about kind of routing um, decisions around resource allocation or around focus in the realities of things that are quite hard to measure, but ultimately can be measured, not in things that haven't yet happened.
Yeah, I'm just trying to the idea sparked when you said the intelligence of crowds, like when you get a bunch of people together who are all trying to solve a problem.
Mm.
And then I thought about there's a prediction market, Polymarket, that had a lot of bets running, especially around the election,
Yeah.
is when it got really big. And they're incredibly like you're tapping into this data set that is what the crowd thinks, and each individual thinks that they're correct.
Mm.
And it seemed like just the dot connection there was maybe it's an interesting way to look at prediction markets and pull kind of knowledge from the general populace that you wouldn't otherwise be able to tap into. Somebody thinks
Yeah.
that they know something. Looking at like niche prediction markets that are made.
I
Um,
think it's
yeah.
interesting. And Polymarket are the organizations I've heard of most in this space. But then you kind of there are plenty of people who have made careers out of effectively not in the same way that perhaps the same methodology that Polymarket have used, but there are plenty of people who have made careers out of just understanding things really well to be able to then kind of predict what might happen. The
Uh,
difference, of course, is that very few have truly made kind of or created a lot of wealth by just creating the conditions for understanding. Most of those people or organizations have had to, in order to create
mm,
wealth, also put the bet on things. So, like, whereas I think Polymarket, its value is really enabling, it's in the ability to
other
provide
people to
odds for
make the
things, right?
market.
So
Yeah.
and ultimately provide odds for things that people wouldn't have been able to provide odds for previously. So, it's that how likely is something to happen or not is the valuable bit, not putting a stake in or putting a horse in the
Yeah.
race, so to speak.
Exactly. And I think Polymarket's revenue model is actually just they make the spread on every single trade that
Mm.
happens. So I might buy something at 60 cents and somebody else might sell it at,
Mm.
38 cents, and Polymarket make that spread. And if I have bought it, then I make the 38 cents. And if I've sold it, then I make the 60 cents. And
Yeah.
Polymarket make the cut regardless.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a brokerage model more or less. So yeah, it's really interesting and I think very smart. I mean, ultimately a very sophisticated kind of model, but I think it also is very indicative of where we are in the world right now, right? It's a very, it's a very,
yeah.
um, it's a very kind of uh, how to best put this, I don't know, without sounding kind of rude about it, because I think I respect the model very much, but I think it's a very kind of um,
Ah,
it's a
be rude.
it's a thin, well, it's a thin extractive layer, isn't it, on things. So
Yeah, yeah, it is. There is some value in providing that market, and there are people that want to do that, but it's not what I want to put my time and effort into building. I want to build a world that I would like to live in, and I keep coming back to this where I see businesses, or I see revenue models, or I see just I see the state of the world right now, and I find myself saying, "Oh shit!" Like some of these things, like autonomous weaponry. We touched on it, but not in these explicit terms. Like, I don't want to live in a world that has autonomous weapons, that has, you know,
mm,
a thing deciding whether or not to take a human life. I would much rather that we're building things, that we're putting our effort into building things that are
yeah.
not, you know, not life extracting like that.
I guess without wanting to take us down deeper track, for want of a better expression, I guess
Yeah,
it's whether you want to live in a world where those things could never be created in the first instance, or whether you want to live in a world where we could create them but we choose not to, is the question. Because I think that, yes, there are. I think in the latter, then we run the risk of some people choosing not to create them and other people choosing to create them, and because of course people have, generally speaking, freedom of choice in some places and some contexts. In a
yeah,
world where no one can create it to begin with, then of course we run the risk that some of the benefits of creating these things that are unforeseen or that are indirect or are kind of spillover effects never get realized because we're not allowed to, and kind of inhibited. So, yeah, I think there's a big question, a big kind of philosophical question around how we whether it's a question of uh, choice or not ultimately, and who chooses, and who gets the kind of the benefit of this. I think back to some of the innovations that have come out of warfare and that have come out of space travel and have come out of lots of things that are kind of I mean, space travel, of course, very, very different to warfare as such. But I think it's often the exercise of power in some form or another, often by nation states, um,
yeah,
far less so by private companies. And I think what we're seeing now is the kind of privatization of many of these things, which I think is, for me at least, that's the particularly problematic part of all of this, is that it's there's always been the privatization of arms and these things, but more often than not, it's had to be a human being that has kind of pressed the button or whatever it might be. I think it's
hmm
the increasing kind of use of emerging technology that takes decision making out of the hands of human beings that is perhaps the thing that as human beings we're slightly more worried about than we have been before. It just feels like
yeah,
relinquishing, or like we are relinquishing control over some of the sort of the weapons or practices or things that we've historically used to try to gain control.
yeah. Um, to, as you wisely said, not go too deep into this, I actually have the perfect question for you, given to me by a friend who is working with AI tools to do prototyping and to build different kind of SaaS products. And I said, "Do you have a question for my next guest?" And I didn't tell him who it was, but I said that you're intelligent, and was he was touching on this thing of agency, and his question is like, what level of autonomy or like what level of agency do you want to create with? I'm thinking about like the research that you do and the way that you're
Mm.
structuring things. Like, do you, if we fast forward 5 years to time
Yeah.
and you could potentially have a system where you ask a question and it scaffolds everything the way that you might and gives you an answer, would you prefer that, or would you like to have the agency to choose what to choose the map.
Yeah, no, I hear the question. I think it's a nice one. I think that um, there there is a lot that many of these meant that many tools that we currently have at our disposal, but undoubtedly what many tools that will be created going forward will enable us to kind of um, do to uh, to prevent the kind of cold start problem or prevent the kind of creative block, writer's block, just a kind of a pretty human, but actually quite a kind of generally sort of natural thing, which is it's often quite difficult to start with nothing. It's really helpful if you can kind of use something that has already been created to kind of build upon. So I think that's, for me at least, that's how I see these tools fitting into my workflow at the moment, and how I tend to prefer to use them now. I don't suspect that will change markedly going forward. I think that I would like to see myself like I'm not the owner of a proprietary data company, right? I'm a consultant that works often with these organizations, with data companies, but also with clients in order to provide the coalescence of things around something, around some kind of nucleus, some kind of grain, a kernel of something that is different or interesting or a new way of seeing the things. And so I would almost see it as it's like the value that I add is in both the ability to coalesce and convene, but also um, in being able to almost having taste in the way that this data is used and interpreted. And I think that that is inherently a fairly artisanal thing. I don't think that there's not that if I were to say, yeah, let's automate like 90% of what I did, I think I would lose 90% of the value in what I did, or at least
Yeah.
80%, 70%. There's some stuff that needs to be still done by, I would argue, the artisan. You might say, well, yeah, you would say that because that's how you make your money, right? And if you thought that all of it could be automated, then you probably
Mm.
would try to defend the sense of a human in the loop. But I do believe that, and I think
Yeah.
there's a certain degree of discernment that and just having an opinion on things that is not, at least right now, possible with the tools that we have available. They aren't opinionated; they are generative based on
Yeah.
existing opinions.
Yeah. I completely agree. And actually, like, I understand the argument for being defensive of some industries and of some things, but uh, going back to basic economics, supply and demand of things, if creating something is extremely easy, if the supply of this thing is like that, then um, general information is going to be not worth as much. But it leans into this. We have more curation, we have more taste, we have like the value of all of these things goes right up, and especially having the ability to understand these things across time and to understand how humans make decisions and the specific people that you work with and the subtleties of these things. I completely agree with you that the value that you bring in the way that you tell these stories and in the way that you choose the specific data, it is, yeah, it's not a commoditizable thing. I do see some industries like law, I think, will have a big shift. And I think that there are a lot of industries that will have big shifts. But this is not to say that those jobs won't exist. The tasks will just be different.
Yeah, I think so. In some instances, I think it can be really helpful to automate and to vastly reduce costs, to vastly reduce points of failure prospectively, particularly people as points of failure within systems. But in other instances, I think we do so at our peril, really because there is no substitute, or at least for now, there is no substitute um, for taste and opinion, and for that
Yeah.
highly subjective element of our daily lives, which is sort of fashion ultimately, or the kind of the prevailing social um, temperature around certain things. And I think we can start to better understand that. Absolutely. I mean, I've went back when I was working at Nesta, kind of 12 years ago. We did a project called the Political Futures Tracker that tried to predict, and successfully did predict, the outcome of the 2015 general election. And we used, when the Twitter fire hose was still publicly available, we used Twitter data to, and didn't cost £500,000 a year or whatever. I don't know if you can even get access to it in the same. Don't know if you'd want access to it in the same way now, but yeah, when the Twitter hose was still available, we could harvest vast quantities of social media data, which was principally about understanding people's opinions and
Yeah.
doing so in conjunction with keywords. It was fairly basic natural language processing, but it allowed us to better understand. What it didn't allow us to do, of course, was to craft new tastes, or to craft new opinions, or anything like that. And so, yeah, I think again it boils down to kind of the sort of the taking what already exists in the world versus making, creating something new. And this kind of taking versus making is fundamentally the kind of the dichotomy, I guess, in value creation. Taking is about bringing things together and almost churning the pot. Making is about something fundamentally new.
Interesting. Um, hmm. So I have two things, and then I think we should wrap up, because I've kept you for a long time on a day that you should have time with your family. I would like to play a quick game if you're up for it.
Yeah.
Maybe you've heard of this. I'll do my best to describe it. It's essentially a market. It's a trader's game, and we choose a market. We choose a number that we're trying to guess, and we have to be able to verify this number. So, an example could be number of shark attacks in the world in 2014. Let's not use that one, because I know the answer to that.
Okay.
But we choose a market, and then we bid to see who can make the smallest range. And so I might say, all right, I think I can get shark attacks within 1,000, and you go, I can get it within 500, and then I go, all right, I can't make that market, you make it. So you go, all right, within 500, it's between 200 and 700 shark attacks in a year. It's actually much lower than that. But does this make sense?
Yes, it does.
Who
wants to go?
Well, I think we need to pick a market, and we need to pick a market that we don't know the numbers on. And the reason I wanted to play this with you is because I love the way your brain works, and we need to be careful about the market, because you know a lot of numbers.
Yeah. What? Yeah. I mean,
so my thinking is maybe a category that is that's not to do with startups or ecosystems, but something that's kind of net positive. And we can use a region that you're familiar with, but it's got to be something that we don't know.
Yeah, I guess something, and that this is something. Yeah, so it has to. You have to be able to validate it. Is the condition, right? You have to know what. Well, someone has to be able to find out what the answer is.
We could do it where we say, all right, we're all right with an answer from an AI, and it can do its best to figure that out.
Okay.
But it is, I think it's nice to know a number. So to give an example, one of the ones I played with a friend was number of Hyatt hotels in America.
Okay.
or in the USA. So it
Yeah.
can be literally anything. Something that's coming to mind is the worldwide panda population. I understand that they are not endangered anymore, but I don't know what that means.
Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking about my first. I don't know why I thought this. Maybe I saw something out the corner of my eye in my room or something. But I was thinking like the population of tigers in the wild or something like that. I think that would be quite the number of, or I mean, you could even go slightly more macro, right? And to the point that you made and combined with the other is like how 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 many species of animal are classed as endangered? Let's say,
Ooh.
or something like that, or how many have become endangered, and you net that out against how many that have become not endangered. So the population has increased, and I think that could be quite interesting.
Oh, I think that's a really small number. We can try. Should we try? Let's first play how many species of animal are classed as endangered
Yes.
in 20 let's do 2025 data just because I don't know if we'll have 2026 consensus.
Yes.
What do you
Agreed.
think?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And so we're first of all we're thinking about a range. We're not sharing that necessarily, but then we're going back and forth a little bit on what that range and getting down to kind of
Yeah.
this possible range. Nice. Okay.
So yeah. So you share your range. You say, yeah. So I can start.
Mhm.
Oh, and I don't even know how many species of animals there are. That's gonna be a real problem. Okay, I'm gonna get it within 500.
Okay.
Oh, that's quite small.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, it's quite a bold
No,
first bet, right? I was thinking
it's
of
a
letting you
it's a
have that, but I didn't
sorry. No,
It was a
no,
good
no, no.
game.
Let me rebid. I want to rebid
Okay.
2,000.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I could do 2,000.
Yeah, I think that feels more realistic. I'll go down to 1,000. I think I could get it within 1,000.
Do you have a number in mind?
No, not yet.
Okay. So my math is that there's somewhere in the order of oh no, this is too low. I think there's somewhere in the order of 200,000 species of animal, but that can't be right because I think there's some wild number in the Amazon. Yeah, I mean this is the game. I'm gonna go 800. I think I can get it within 800.
I think, and on that basis, I'll let you have it because I don't think I can do any better than that. I don't know if we're even aiming in the right direction. So I was hoping you'd say something because I didn't want to go for it at 1,000. You can have it.
We might be orders of magnitude off. Okay, I'm gonna say between 2,000. There's between 2,000 and 2,800 endangered species in 2025.
Okay. You're going to validate that now, are you?
I'm gonna try and validate it. How many endangered species are there in 2025? All right.
If you get it, I'll buy you a drink.
Oh, I'm way off. So according to UICN, the UICN Red List, It's 172,620 species on the list,
Wow.
of which 48,646 are threatened with extinction.
Wow.
Damn.
Yeah, that
It's
is
a lot.
it is a lot. I guess the purpose of the game is not to have a moral to the story,
No.
but if there were a moral to the story, it's that we're possibly slightly more optimistic than we should be about the state of the world that we live in from an environmental perspective.
And this is exactly what someone who interprets data would think like that. Would you like to play one more time with the number that have become not endangered?
Yes, that would be interesting. I mean, again, it's probably going to point. My initial interpretation would lead me to suggest that anything that we say is probably, even knowing this, is going to be wildly optimistic. But let's have a go. You fed this to me knowing that we were going to play this game. That endangered. But if we believe that pandas are no longer endangered and that may be the case for others as well, then I guess thinking about those that are not endangered, maybe I can start with a range. I'll give you a range of 500.
Oh, the competitive part of me wants to outbid you, but I don't want to.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I could go 400, but it would be a stab in the dark like the last one. I do think that I'm more calibrated this time.
Are you going to go 400 then?
Let's also define, and if this changes your answer, I'm just thinking like have left the endangered species list from when, like in the last 10 years, do we say, or do we say in a year period?
I think maybe,
Or
yeah.
all time?
So I don't think it would change, at least not with the range that I've given. I don't think it would change it markedly. Probably not over a 10-year period, really.
Okay,
But
let's call it a 10-year period then.
Yeah, let's say 10 years. And this is just those that have left. So those animals that, or those species that were endangered, but now are not because not because they've gone extinct, but because they have seen population increases. And so they have become, it's a positive story in the sense that they were very low number and now they're less low.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah, that's good for me. I would stick with my initial bet of the range of 500.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna get closer than 500. So you make the market.
I think the market is so I think the number of species of animal that have gone from endangered to not endangered over the last 10 years because they've seen a population increase is between 0 and 500.
Oh yeah, I think you might be right. Okay, in the last 10 years, how many have recovered? How many have gone from endangered to not endangered?
Yep.
I'm repeating that partly so that we have it, and partly because I use this tool that I really like called Super Whisper, and it just takes my babble and puts it into text.
Nice.
All right. Oh, I'm finding it hard to verify this one. It says, of the 163,000 species assessed by IUCN as of 2024, only about 1 in 1,000 have been downlisted due to genuine population improvement. That's roughly 160 species. Nice.
Yeah, there we are. I mean, that's kind of, I like the premise of our kind of our bet there, or at least the kind of the market making range suggestion there. But gosh, that's a bit sad that it's only 160, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty dire. I
Yeah.
I remember reading that like general species population is down since the 60s by some ridiculous percentage, and I won't try and quote it because I can't remember.
Yeah.
But just
Yeah.
like the number of other animals on the planet has gone way down.
To think about how, I guess this relates back to some of the things that we've talked about, there's a great company called Replanet that are effectively enabling corporates as well as others to invest in kind of or kind of renovating or bringing the environment back, whatever environment that might be. I was going to say reforestation, but not all of these environments are forests, of course. And so bringing the environment back to the point at which it was possibly the most kind of biodiverse that it could be, or at least back to a point at which it is kind of less negatively disrupted by human activity. And I think a nice kind of
Yep.
antidote, perhaps, to some of that kind of doom and gloom is that that we are seeing a huge amount of interest and technology-enabled activity, like Replanet, like Curate, a climate marketplace, climate tech marketplace. It's spelled CUR and then the number 8, and
Okay.
others that are really leveraging technologies to do this. And of course, I'm hardly saying anything new here, but I think to kind of to round that out, I think there are some ways in which technology, of course, is making us kind of forget about the world around us. There are some ways in which technology is actively uh, kind of negatively influencing the world around us, but there are some ways in which it truly is kind of transforming our opportunity to engage as people in bringing the world to a place where things are ultimately better from an environmental perspective, and probably better for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we live on this planet, right? Um, Super well put, and so nice to talk to you, George. It always is.
Yes, you too. You
Um,
too. Real pleasure.
Can I, before I let you go, ask for a question for the next person I speak to
Yes, I thought that might
without
be.
knowing who they are?
Yeah. Um, I guess it would. I mean, there are some questions I could ask a question, I guess, about something to do with the world that we're in, but I find the questions about that ask people to reflect on themselves most interesting, often. So,
Mm.
I guess my question would be to your next guest: if you were not doing what you're doing now, um, and you couldn't do what you're doing now, what would you like to be doing?
Mm. Really good question. Um, can I ask you exactly that question?
Mm, from a professional perspective, and this is something I might still do, but
Yeah.
we'll see. I think I would really value, from a personal perspective, but also feel like I might be doing some kind of meaningful and interesting work to be a clinical psychologist, and so I would prospectively kind of go back to university and either kind of do a conversion course, or kind of get onto a medical degree. Um,
Yeah.
From a personal perspective, I think there are so many factors that it's too difficult to say, and that
Yeah.
ultimately there are so many things. But I think, of course, there are lots of things that I might say, well, I would have invested in that had I known, or there in hindsight. But actually, um, I think that yeah, the crux of what I would want to do differently would be, or the crux of what I would do differently if I weren't able to continue doing what I'm doing now, would be to try to bring some of the things that I can do really well, which is sort of um, bringing empathy into professional conversations and kind of contexts, understanding the problems that people face, and how they are manifesting themselves in the context of that person's professional life, usually now, but personal life, respectively, in the case of a more medical profession, or bringing data to bear in terms of being able to understand some of the contextual factors as well as the kind of the specific challenge-based factors. I think they translate quite well into that kind of alternative way of kind of seeing my career. So, but I think in many ways, a lot of what a medical doctor does, and a lot of what a kind of someone in my position does, are not dissimilar. It's often about diagnostics, kind of analysis, and then it's about kind of prescription of something to help kind of alleviate or to kind of cure. So, yeah, it's just that those things, of course, take markedly different forms, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that I'm doing the same thing that a medical doctor is doing from a variety of other perspectives, but there are some similarities, of course, with lots of things.
Yeah, interesting. Ways of different applications, but similar brain patterns, similar problem solving.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed.
amazing. Just on a purely practical note, when we hang up here, if you leave your browser open, it will continue to upload.
Cool.
And I will talk to you very soon.
Perfect. No, it was great speaking to you, Ty, and yeah, hopefully we'll get the chance to catch up in person very soon.
Yeah, cool.
All right.
All
Speak
right.
soon. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.